This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
This is the prisoner's own voice, an opportunity for the prisoners to have their own voice through these images. Megg is a member of the Professional Historians Association Northern Territory and has commenced her doctorate studies, and currently residing in Alice Springs, has been there for a couple of decades, and it's a long way from her birthplace of the UK. So please welcome.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay. Yes, so this is one of those papers where the abstract's not quite what you're going to get today, but anyway, I hope you will forgive me. I want to begin my discussion of what is a very emotionally difficult subject by asking you some very personal questions. What comes to mind when you think of men in chains? Do you see the chained body of a Negro slave? Or like a turn-of-the-century West Australian politician, the uniformed body of a leg-chained Australian convict? Or do you see the neck-chained Aboriginal prisoners, the loose ends of their chains held by a black tracker or uniformed European policeman, or with the tracker and the policeman absent in your visual memory? And how do these images make you feel? Do you, like Doris Blackwell, the young daughter of a turn-of-the-century Alice Springs postmaster, regard the chaining of human beings as a symbol of man's bestiality to man? Something depraved and sadistic? Or like Jane Lydon, the author of a new book on the ways in which photography has prompted recognition of Indigenous rights, are you stirred to pity and anger on behalf of the men depicted here? And now I want to change track and ask you to think about handcuffs. Are the handcuffs in your mind's eye, are the hands black or white, male or female? Do you think of crime, or maybe you think of sex? And how do you feel? Relief perhaps that a criminal has been caught? Compassion for his loss of liberty? Pleasure, pain, or nothing at all? Or given the context in which I'm asking these questions, do you feel quietly relieved that we live in a world whose punishments are more humane than those meted out by our forebears? And finally, in a last change of track, I want you to think practically. If, like the men in this photograph, taken in 1906, you had to walk from Alice Springs in the middle of Australia to Oodnadatta before catching a train to Port Augusta, would you have preferred to have travelled hands tied or hands free? With your response to those questions in mind, I want to turn your attention now to a moment at the end of 1929 when the Australian government banned the use of neck chains in the Northern Territory. And I want to use this small episode in Australian penal history to reflect on the place of punishment in modern society more generally. Though it goes against the grain of much contemporary thought, I want to suggest that the ban on neck chains was more politically symbolic than practical. That is, it did more to restore faith in the shaken authority of the state than it did to improve the embodied experience of the Indigenous prisoner. This is because it originated as much in the emotionally murky creek beds of regional identity and mainstream electoral politics as it did in the healing waters of humanitarian goodwill. The ban was a pragmatically political response to media-fuelled moral outrage, not the rational outcome of a clear penal agenda. It was instituted to appease an audience that was as international as it was domestic, more coastal and white than Indigenous or remote, and more law-abiding than criminal. As such, the ban on neck chains tells us more about the ways in which regionally asynchronous technological development drives change than it tells us about penal progress. As Mark Finane has observed, though changes in penal practice are invariably influenced by macro-historical processes, they are also driven by local conditions. Examining the local in the context of the macro can help us identify the limits of what is punitively possible. So, to the local story. The decision to ban neck chains in Central Australia was made in December 1929. Internationally, the American stock market had just crashed, plunging the world into global economic crisis, and nationally, the Australian Labor Party had just defeated the Liberals in a tightly fought election. Though it is incredibly difficult to believe, Alice Springs, with a European population of about 50, had just been made a national capital. Central Australia was in the middle of the worst drought on record, and there were huge tensions between water-hungry pastoralists and Indigenous nomads. These tensions had erupted in extreme violence in 1928 when an Aboriginal man killed a European settler at Coniston Station, and a police-led punitive expedition responded by killing many, many, many more Indigenous men, women and children. As news of the killings reached the Australian coast, an outraged southern public demanded an inquiry. The inquiry exonerated the police. 3 years later, when Yolngu warriors in the top end of Australia killed Japanese treepangers and a European policeman in Arnhem Land, public protests prevented the police from taking the same kind of punitive action. The killing times were over, leaving the massacre at Coniston with the dubious distinction of being widely remembered as the last state-sanctioned massacre of Indigenous people in Australian history. Frontier violence, once the object of police pride, was now a source of national shame. Jane Lardon has argued that photographs were integral to this rapid and decisive shift in public opinion. New printing technologies developed in the late 1920s put documentary photographs on the front pages of the world's newspapers. Widely understood to be mechanical reproductions of reality, the news photo brought coastal Australians into intimate proximity with life on Australia's last frontier. The same photos also connected international audiences to the remote edges of the British Commonwealth. The image of the neck-chained Aboriginal prisoner helped forge these connections. Mary Montgomery Bennett, a West Australian humanitarian who spent 3 decades harnessing the international feminist movement, harnessing international feminist support for the Aboriginal cause, was particularly struck by this picture of Aboriginal prisoners at the Alice Springs jail, which was published in the Melbourne Herald a fortnight before the government banned the use of neck chains in Central Australia. The picture crystallised Bennett's much proselytised belief that Central Australian Aboriginal people jailed for killing stock during drought served their sentences neck-chained to each other. Shortly after Bennett formed this idea, another humanitarian, the missionary Ernst Kramer, who held weekly church services inside the Alice Springs jail, described conditions very differently. According to Kramer, native prisoners were in the pink of condition, having daily outdoor exercise and coconut mats and blankets in their cells. They were decently clothed and better provided for than scores of the hungry in the bush. Numbers purposely broke the law to secure the luxury of imprisonment. Jail was a popular place among Aborigines, chiefly because it solved their hunger problems. So who should we believe? Where did the information which so convinced Bennett really come from? And why did Kramer's eyewitness account fail to moderate the beliefs of other humanitarian activists? The only question I can answer with any certainty today is the question about the origins of the belief that Aborigines in the Alice Springs jail served their sentences in chains. The claim was made just 1 week before the Melbourne Herald published this photo, which so influenced Bennett. And it was made in a letter to the editor, written by Charles Kelham, who, though he had absolutely no statutory authority to do so, used his position as a member of the Port Augusta Board of Health to ask the local jailer to show him around. Somewhat surprisingly, given what he found, the jailer agreed. Kelham was accompanied by a well-known but never named solicitor. His letter began, "Sir, the public of South Australia ought to know of the conditions of the Alice Springs jail. We read a lot about the blacks being shot down like dogs, but shooting is hardly worse than their treatment at Alice Springs. Not only the poor blacks, but our own countrymen are shockingly treated, and yet we call ourselves white Australians." Kelham's moral outrage was provoked by the appalling stench of human excrement, which, combined with the smell of black prisoners, was something he thought no European prisoner should be forced to endure. Though Kelham mentioned the existence of chain rings to which prisoners could be chained, he made no claim that prisoners were attached to them. Notwithstanding this, his letter was published under the heading, "Hardly Fit for Dogs, Shocking State of Alice Springs Jail, 20 Natives Chained to Wall." The following day, the same newspaper published an editorial headed, "A Federal Prison Scandal," in which it claimed that the chaining of prisoners in Alice Springs was especially disgraceful given that now Alice was a capital city, a place connected to rail by civilisation and the headquarters from which the federal government pretends to administer one of its territories. "Is this a sample of federal administration in Central Australia?" the editor asked. "And if it is, should South Australia has at least one reason to regret the Northern Territory Agreement?" The editor, it would seem, had opposed the transfer of the Northern Territory to the Commonwealth in 1911. On day 3, the paper continued its campaign against the newly elected federal government in an article headed, "Jail Horror Confirmed by Police Officer." The police officer, like the well-respected solicitor in the original letter to the editor, was not named. Finally, on day 4, the paper's unsubstantiated claims were published around the country under the heading, "Chained Natives." The object of Kelham's original concern, the appalling conditions in which European men were being imprisoned, was omitted from these reports, as was his contention that the incarceration of whites, close to foul-smelling blacks, was as bad as massacre. The newly elected Labor Minister of the Interior responded with a well-researched denial of the newspaper's claims, during the course of which he pointed out that it was South Australia and not the Commonwealth which had built the jail with its chain rings. Despite any evidence for the claim, the Minister also ordered the practice of chaining Aboriginal prisoners to be discontinued forthwith and other more humane methods adopted. Like Mary Bennett, who spent many years campaigning against the use of neck chains in Western Australia, where they remained legal, the Minister of the Interior made no distinction between the punitive use of neck chains within the confines of a prison cell and their use in transporting prisoners from one place to another. If we look again at the photo that crystallised Bennett's beliefs, we notice that it is taken outside, not inside the jail, and is, like Kelham's letter, no proof of the claim that prisoners were chained throughout their prison terms. Historians of documentary photos remind us that we need to treat images the same way as we treat text. That is, we need to contextualise them by asking who took the photo, for what purpose, when was it published, how was it viewed. Though I cannot answer these questions with regard to this photo, I can put this photo in the context of other photos of Alice's Indigenous prisoners, most of which have not been published. These photos show two things. First, the unchained Aboriginal prisoners at work and play were a familiar sight on the streets of Alice Springs. Second, that with few exceptions, neck chains were used when prisoners were being taken from the remote locations where they were arrested to the nearest courthouse or police cell. In an area of country the size of Germany and France put together, with an estimated maximum population of less than 10,000 people, including nomads, it is not surprising that the institutions of a Western-style criminal justice system were often hundreds of miles apart. The motorised prison truck, which had hid prisoners from public view and were the norm in coastal cities at the time of the neck chain ban, did not exist in Central Australia until after World War II. The region's only jail, built in 1909, had no perimeter walls, and the place didn't get a courthouse until 1935. The infrastructure which assisted the development of non-corporal punitive sensibilities in coastal regions of Australia did not exist in Central Australia when they'd become the norm elsewhere. None of these practicalities of remote policing, nor the historical context which had given rise to the use of neck chains in the first place, appears to have been considered by the coastally based humanitarian reformers. In a cashless economy, the fine was not a punitive option, leaving as punitive alternatives the police-led massacre, flogging or imprisonment. Brakes were put on the use of the massacre after Mounted Constable Wilshire was charged with murder and himself walked in chains to Port Augusta in 1891. Flogging was illegal without a magistrate's order, and magistrates, like courthouses, were few and far between. By the 1890s, flogging was also deeply offensive to coastal punitive sensibilities, so that although a steady succession of Centralians, including missionaries, anthropologists and the police, suggested it as a practical, culturally appropriate and more comprehensible punishment than the foreign rituals of a courthouse for native prisoners, the idea was rejected as callous and inhumane by coastal humanitarians whose views informed the decisions of the coastal administrators who governed Australia's centre. As Peter Donovan has noted, it is a characteristic of Central Australia that much of what happens there is influenced by people and events in far distant places, and punishment is no exception. In this context, it is not surprising that shortly after the neck chains were banned, Northern Territory Police lobbied for their return. Sergeant Lovegrove, a policeman with a reputation for following the letter of the law rather than taking justice into his own hands, described how a particular prisoner, when handcuffed to a tree, was quite unable to move and was tortured throughout the night by ants and mosquitoes and other insects. Whilst marching by day with his hands secured, he was just as much tortured by flies. The ban was eventually rescinded in 1935 with the consent of humanitarian activists, but not before the image of the neck-chained native prisoner had become an instantly and internationally recognised symbol of colonial injustice and white inhumanity, a powerful visual trope linked to the end of the African slave trade. The use of slavery trope to propel penal reform in Australia is not new. British-based humanitarian groups had used it to end the flogging of European convicts in the 1840s in New South Wales, at a time when prison walls were also absent from that colony's penal infrastructure. As John Hurst argues, flogging as a disciplinary measure at least had the advantage of giving convicts some freedom. Though humanitarian campaigns to ban chains and flogging might not accord with our own contemporary punitive sensibilities, making it hard for us to see anything other than brutality in images of neck-chained prisoners, these images are not without their own limitations. As Christine Twomey has argued, while photographs of suffering collapse the distance between the subject of suffering and the viewer, they also rely on the creation of difference for their empathetic appeal. In the campaign against massacre, neck chains and conditions real or imagined in the Alice Springs jail, this collapse of space included distancing the native criminal from his crimes. Humanitarians did this by presenting the native criminal as the childlike and innocent victim of colonial injustice, whose salvation was only possible with the support of European aid. The possibility that, as some contemporary scholars argue, the neck-chained prisoner was the avenging warrior of a dispossessed nation, the fittest, not the weakest of the tribe, was erased. As such, the image of the neck-chained prisoner was, Jane Lydon argues, itself deeply complicit in another form of colonial injustice, one which robbed individual prisoners of their story and the story of Indigenous resistance from public view. The image of the hapless native prisoner, subjected to anomalous punitive practices in a familiar but barbarous Australian north, was also used by the newspaper editor in his politically motivated campaign against the federal government. As George Herbert Mead has argued, the rituals of criminal procedure provide authorised occasion for the release of complex emotions which are not allowed expression elsewhere. By taking part in the emotional defence of society's interests against criminal depredations, the individual shores up his own sense of in-group identity. South Australian horror at remote punitive practice helped align South Australian identity to its new political borders. Emile Durkheim has argued that crime prevention is only one of punishment's many social functions. Another more important function is the protection and regeneration of social solidarity through the manipulation of symbolic forms designed to maintain the confidence of law-abiding citizens in the transcendent authority of the state. After the massacre at Coniston and the government's exonerating the police in that action, the ban on neck chains was an easy way to reaffirm the authority of the state. Thank you.